Hey, this is Dr. C again. So, I wasn't going to talk about this today, but I figured I had to. Do you recall maybe 5 months ago, I had Jane Lockery, Dr. Jane Lockery with me, and we spoke about the very recent onset of the COVID infection. And that was this material that was available to us at the time. Obviously, there's been a little more material since then, certainly nowhere near the material that's out in print. You can't believe 3/4, if not more, of that material that's out there. Ridiculous amount of material. I guess they don't have anything else to write about except maybe the presidential campaign, you know? But at any rate, don't believe what you read in the papers. That's number one. Number two, I don't believe most of the stuff that's handed out by the government. And believe me, I'm not a conspiratorial person. I don't believe in conspiracies. But I do believe in stupidity. And don't believe any of the stuff that comes from our leaders. The one person that I do believe is Tony Fauci. I believe what he tells me because he knows what's going on and he doesn't mince words. Not afraid to. I thought I liked our own governor, and most of the time I do. But basically, the bottom line here is, and I'm talking now to seniors. Seniors. We've recently passed the 200,000 deaths in the United States. 200,000. 94% of the deaths in Massachusetts, and in Massachusetts we have something like 9,250, something like that. 94% are people who are 60 years of age or older. And that really goes up a lot. And we're going to put that onto the website here. That big spike that you see, that's 80 and over, the deaths. Now, what do our esteemed people, the ones who are our leaders, what do they say about it? Well, it's out in print and you can read it. For example, it affects virtually nobody. That's what our president said. It virtually affects nobody. Here he was talking mostly about children. And infants have a 0.1 or something, very, very low mortality rate. Children have a low mortality rate. Teenagers have a low mortality rate. Then it begins to creep up. And once it hits the 60 mark, it creeps up fast. Once it hits 80, it goes way up. So isn't that nice? And I'm talking to you seniors. Isn't it nice that your president thinks you're nobody? Virtually nobody, anyway. Not just nobody. Well, what else do they say? Can you trust the CDC? Well, if you do, think about what the CDC has done for you. Number one, they rejected the World Health Organization testing. I don't know why. They wanted to do it themselves. That delayed 2-3 weeks. Then they finally put a test out, and it was flawed. Couldn't use it. The reagents were lousy. Wonderful. Another 2-3 weeks lost. No tests. Finally, they put it out, and they put it out just in select areas. And then it had to be sent back to the CDC. Took over a week to get a report. You can't believe anything that the CDC tells you. They put out nice print, very nice print. They got good publishing. But don't put that as gospel. Okay. What else? Well, I don't know if you listen to Howie Carr at all, but I read a lot of his novels about the Bolger brothers and all. But Howie Carr does pick up on things very fast, very fast. He picked up on the fact that our governor, Charles Baker, was called Charlie Parker, who was a jazz musician, Charlie Parker. Well, he still calls him Charlie Parker. Either that or Tall Duval. I know he makes fun of people. Hey, so does our president, for that matter, But at any rate, he puts conflicting reports in the paper. Every day, we get a number of coronavirus cases and deaths. And we're supposed to be on a great path. Well, that great path has not gone down any further in the last couple of months. It is still at that baseline and slowly rising as they are going through all of this rebirth now of our economy. So at any rate, why conflicting numbers? Every day, conflicting numbers. You think he'd fire somebody who was putting out that crap. So at any rate, that's what our leaders are saying. That's why I'm telling you, believe Tony Fauci. And let me tell you a few things about COVID. Like I said, it's been maybe 5 months now since we had our little discussion about that. So 94% of deaths in Massachusetts are elderly, over 60. 80% in the United States are over 60. And the lowest number, believe it or not, is in some of the southern states, 70%, for example. Nobody lower than 70, though. It definitely is a virus that hits the elderly hard. It's written off, well, it's because you got coexisting things. You get a lot more as you get older. You guys are on the way out anyway. Yep, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. How does COVID hit the younger people with symptoms? Well, they haven't changed, really. Fever, cough, shortness of breath, maybe a little change in smell or taste. Not too much change. But in the elderly, it can present differently. For example, there are people who have just been confused. And when they're confused, they don't eat properly. They don't sleep properly. Nothing very specific. COVID test, positive. So, they may be just dizzy. And maybe the day before they were walking fine. They get dizzy, and then bang, they're on the floor, they fall. Test them for COVID. A lot of them may be positive. Some of them get dehydrated very quickly. Boy, I got my water right here. I don't get dehydrated. Well, I do get dehydrated, yes, I do. I gotta admit it. More nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea in the elderly as well. So, they have different set of symptoms. They need to know, people need to realize that. So, yes, we do have some pre-existing conditions. But when you notice when the papers tell you about pre-existing conditions, they always mention hypertension right at the top of the list. What the hypertension? 60% of us have hypertension when we get elderly. 60%. And believe it or not, if you treat that hypertension, do you get a decrease in the number of deaths, a decrease in the heart attacks, a decrease in cardiovascular symptoms? No. That's an interesting tidbit. Why? Because antihypertensive medication is a $6 billion a year product. Something to think about. Is hypertension a risk factor? Yes, but there are major risk factors and minor risk factors. Hypertension is in that minor risk factor. Same with asthma. Same with dementia. What are in the high risk categories? Cardiovascular disease, chronic renal disease, chronic lung problems like COPD. Obesity is in that high risk category with a BMI over 30. BMI over 40 is even worse. People who are immunosuppressed, who have been on cancer drugs, for example, or steroids for a long time. And type 2 diabetes is in that high risk category as well. Remember, please, and we discussed this back several months ago. If you're exposed to somebody who has had COVID-19, who are positive, it may take anywhere between 2 to 14 days to show up. So don't feel comfortable if you get a test the day after that's negative. You need to redo that test, maybe 2-3 times more. Okay, at any rate, let me talk a little bit about testing, because that's what we hear a lot about now, testing and vaccine. Okay, let's talk about both, but testing first. What kind of tests are there? How many tests are there? Do you know just in the antibody test alone, there are over 200 antibody tests out there. Now, there haven't been 200 approved, but there are 200 plus out there. So if you're going to get a test, find out what kind of test it is and ask a simple question. What is the sensitivity and specificity of this test? Now, what do I mean by that? The sensitivity of a test will tell you the test is positive if you're positive. So in other words, you can get a false positive if you don't have the virus and it still comes out positive, or you can get a false negative. You have the disease, but it came out negative. So that's the sensitivity of the test. What's the specificity of the test? That will tell you if you're negative, it'll come out negative. So you can get a false negative and you can get a false positive in that specificity area. Many of these tests have very good specificity because they've defined the little proteins that are on this virus. They've defined them very well, and so when they're positive, the specificity is good. It's the sensitivity of the test. Why should we get so many false negatives? That's the big issue, false negatives. You got the disease, but it doesn't show up. You get a false negative test. And that's right down the line. There are 3 types of testing categories that are out there. The most common one that's used is the very first one that was used, and that is the reverse transcriptase polymerase chain reaction. Wow, RT-PCR. They never tell you what that means because most of them don't know. But nevertheless, that's the one where they put that swab down into the nasopharynx, swab it around, put it into a tube with a reagent in it, send it off to the lab. So it's not a point of contact test most of the time. Now they do have some rapid tests that will accomplish that as well. And so it's called a molecular test, basically. It's a little easier than saying reverse transcriptase polymerase chain reaction. And incidentally, what the heck does that mean anyway? Well, I'll try to make it simple for you. Our bodies have DNA. What is DNA? The DNA is sort of the blueprint for the creation of the cells. It's a blueprint. How does that DNA eventually get to the point where it's producing proteins, which is basically the structure of the body, the whole different number of proteins? How does it get from DNA to protein? Well, it's very simple. RNA. RNA is a single strand. DNA is a double strand. That RNA is much smaller. And if you can produce a piece of RNA that goes onto the DNA, then that RNA is able to eventually create a new protein. That's how it works. So if you can reverse that, in other words, if you have an RNA virus, like the COVID virus, you got an RNA virus, you have another piece of RNA, a little smaller, goes on to the RNA, and it copies that. So that's a reverse transcriptase. Now, what does the polymerase do? What it does, it amplifies the DNA or the RNA. In other words, it multiplies it. You get a whole bunch of them then. That can show up positive on a test. So that's how it works. Takes going to a lab, though. It's not that simple a technique, and so that's why the delay in getting results. So that's the first type of test, called a molecular test. And so right now there's 5 separate rapid molecular tests that have been approved for emergency usage. The EUA, Emergency Use Authorization. 5 of them. And of course, Abbott is right up there at the top. There's several others. Roche produces one. Q produces one. Cepheid produces one. Biotech produces the 5th. How accurate is it? Well, if you have the virus, it's very active. In other words, specificity is very high. How about the sensitivity? That varies. In China, for example, it was probably only about 30%. 30%. In other words, 70% of the time it was accurate, but 30% false negative. In this country, again, don't believe a darn thing you hear in the press. Don't believe them. Because they're fed different numbers by the companies that are selling this stuff. Roughly 10 to 30% of the tests, just like in China. So 70 to 80% are good, 20, 30% or so, no. You get false negatives if you have the disease. So, okay. What's another type of test? Well, after that first test with the nasopharynx, they wanted something that would be a point of action. They wanted something that's rapid. And so they came out with these antibody tests. And they measured the circulating antibodies in our body towards coronavirus. So they call that either the IgG, IgM, whatever. They're testing the antibodies in our body. So that means a blood sample. Either finger stick, ear stick, blood in a vein stick, whatever. But it takes blood. And that test is rapid. You can get a result within 30 minutes. So that is a point of service type of test that looks for these protein segments in the blood. There are 4 types that are used at the present time. And why don't we go through them? There's called a rapid diagnostic test, RDT, rapid diagnostic test. And that usually is a problem because it cross-reacts with other coronaviruses. Can't distinguish which coronavirus you may have. Remember, coronavirus is out there. There have been coronavirus respiratory infections, like a cold, for example. Coronavirus can cause that. Well, this test doesn't distinguish between coronavirus with a cold or coronavirus with a COVID-19. So that's a problem. That's a problem. So what's another type of test? Another type is called a lateral flow test. Lateral flow. Now you may be familiar with the pregnancy test. That's a lateral flow test. So what it does is that you put a drop of the blood onto that test, and slowly it'll reach that reagent on that strip. And if you have the COVID virus, it'll show the antibodies reacting to the antigen on that strip. In other words, you get a positive. So it's the antibody that's in that serum that's going to cause that. So that's called a lateral flow test. That's a little better, and it is a point of action type of test. Then there's the ELISA test, E-L-I-S-A, ELISA test. That stands for enzyme-linked immunoassay. Enzyme-linked immunoassay. So what they do with that, there's a plate, a little plate. And they put on that plate viral protein. Now, the scientists have identified a number of proteins on the viruses. The major one is the spike protein. In fact, there are several spike proteins, but one of the spike proteins. Or they may use what they call the nuclear envelope. Little envelope on that little virus. That also is a protein that will show up. Or they may have others. There's 4 major proteins that are on these viruses. So they're on the plate, and now they put the serum on the plate, which incubates with those antigen that's on the plate, and it will show up either with a chemical reaction, which shows color, or fluorescent. So it could be a chemiluminescent type of thing as well. So that is an ELISA test as well. That is a little more accurate, but still has some false negatives. The final one is called a neutralization test. Neutralization test. And what they do here is they will put a virus with cell cultures in different concentrations of virus on these cell cultures, and then add the serum. And that's a little more quantitative in its results. All these others are all qualitative. This is quantitative, at least semi-quantitative. Why semi-quantitative? Because you want to know, how long is this immunity going to last? They can't tell you yet. They don't know. Okay. Those are the antibody tests. Now, we also have tests against the antigen. That's those proteins that are on the virus. Most of the proteins are spike proteins. There's also the nuclear membrane as well. So those are the 2 major proteins that are in the antigen test as well. And there are 4 of them, 4 tests that are approved, emergency approved, in the United States today. Okay, so those are the tests that are out there and the problems with the tests. Okay, let's go on. We described a little bit about that. Let's tell you, how we led into this with the number of seniors now who are at risk. We're at risk now even more because people are going to school again. Yes, it's not going to kill the kids, but the kids are going to come home. They want to hug their grandpa or grandma. Unfortunately, right now, not a good time to do it. What can we do as seniors to try to advocate for ourselves? Because nobody's going to help us. That's very obvious. No one. You got to advocate for yourself. What do? You got to take your own precautions. When you're interacting, don't interact with a big crowd. Make sure everybody around you has a mask. Very important. And about masks, incidentally. When the masks were first used, we said, you're protecting others, that's why you're wearing it. Well, that was BS too. Masks protect you and protect the others as well. It protects you as well. So it protects both ways. Studies now have been done. It shows that the surgical mask, that 3-layer mask that most of us are wearing, are almost as efficient as that N95 mask. And remember, a lot of those N95 masks now are coming from China, and they are not good masks. So, don't spend the extra money for an N95 mask. Wear a good surgical mask. And wear the mask. Wear it. Okay. So you need to limit your outside activities. That doesn't mean you can't go shopping. Although there's some very good deals out there, people will shop for you. Bring it to your house. So, again, never go out if you have symptoms. Make sure nobody comes in to see you if they have symptoms. Outdoor activities are better than indoor, especially if you're going to have any length to the activity at all. So, maintain social distancing. Wash your hands. I showed you how to wash your hands for at least 20 seconds. Good scrub, soap and water, best thing in the world. And if you're going to use a hand sanitizer, make sure it has 60% alcohol plus in it. And then disinfect all commonly used surfaces. That's not a common way to contract COVID, but it is a way. And so you need to do all of the simple things, especially the mask and the distancing, and protect yourself until the vaccines become available. I've got a whole talk on vaccines as well, and we should probably have that. You need to know about that ahead of time. This is Dr. C. Thank you for listening in.